Podcasting can take many forms and styles. The podcast is growing. The podcast has become a great way to share and create content for brands and marketers. Today we are visiting the headquarters of HubSpot here in Boston, and we're having as guest to Sam Balter. Sam is a podcast marketer specialist in the company, and we are going to talk about the boom of podcasting. Hey Sam, how are you?
I'm doing great, Juan Carlos. How are you?
I am great, my friend. Thank you for your time. I'm so excited to be here with you in HubSpot. Sam, we work in the podcasting field, and I have a question for you. I would like to know, what is your opinion about the podcasting boom that we are seeing right now?
Yeah, there's been a lot of attention to podcasting right now. And I think a lot of that has to do with Spotify's recent acquisitions. They said they recently acquired Gimlet Media, right, as well as Anchor, which is an app for building and distributing podcasts. Mm-hmm. And they also recently just bought another podcasting company, Parcast, and have devoted to spending around $500 million on content this year. So a ton of attention has been paid to podcasting, and a lot of people look at it as if it's this huge boom that just came out of nowhere. But podcasting has been around for years. Oh, yeah. It's been steadily increasing in the number of listeners year over year over year. So I think people are looking at this boom and saying, is this the start of a hockey stick growth for podcasting? Exactly. And for me, I think the biggest thing that I'm seeing is just there's more options than Apple Podcast, and they're getting a lot of attention. Right. So Android phones, which make up the majority of phones, now Google is going to be pre-installing a podcast app on all of them. Huge new opportunity there. Spotify, when we look at the growth in listenership in Spotify, a lot of it has actually come out of Latin America and Latin American countries. Yep, exactly. So you're seeing whole new groups of people coming online to listen to podcasts. The thing that's super interesting is content needs to catch up a little bit, right? Whereas there's tons and tons of new people listening to podcasts, the vast majority of podcasts are still in English and they're still American. Exactly. So I think for me, when I'm looking at podcasting, I'm excited most about the growth that's going to occur internationally. Exactly. When we start bringing on whole new groups of people, when we start building in whole new types of content. And I think the other thing that's really interesting about the boom, speaking of content, is like, podcasts are getting turned into TV shows.
Exactly.
Yeah, like all of a sudden.
Switching.
Yeah, like it's something I don't think I ever really would have predicted. But like podcasting is being seen as a way to like build an audience. And not only that, by showing that podcasts can be more than just talk shows. They could be more than just news or updates. Mm-hmm. They could be full narrative series. It's just like people's minds are really starting to open up to the possibilities of what podcasting could be.
That's a good point about how podcasts can switch, in this case, to kind of TV shows. But it's funny because there is a podcast on Spotify, and it's about El Chapo Guzman. Pretty much the same of Netflix, like 9 episodes, like storytelling, very interesting. In fact, Sam, you are right about Latin America. My podcast is focused in this part of the world. And I saw in the stats that the show has increased the numbers of plays over there. And one of my goals is try to show over there the benefits of podcasting as marketing strategy. Sam, it's unbelievable that we have 600,000-ish, more or less, podcasts, and almost 60 million people are listening to podcasts on monthly basis. What do you think about that?
It's huge. And I think that number is very useful to understanding how many podcasts are being created. Mm-hmm. I think it does slightly skew people's view of things, though, right, because it makes it seem like it's an even distribution and that everybody is getting roughly the same amount of listens. Exactly. Whereas, like anything else, like YouTube or even like Spotify for music artists, there's a top group of people who are garnering all of the downloads or most of the downloads, and then a group of people in the middle, and then a ton of podcasts that get almost no distribution. Exactly. They might have a few downloads and they're just getting started. Right. So I think that number of 600,000, it could be really intimidating to people. Exactly. It's that kind of like, oh, why should I start a podcast now? There's already so many. But if you were looking at YouTube and you said, wow, there's already 500,000 videos on YouTube, there's no way I could be popular on YouTube. Right. That's ridiculous. Like, just because there's a large quantity of them and some of them are getting downloads doesn't mean that there's not necessarily a huge opportunity there.
Exactly. I mean, you have to do your own strategy, your buyer persona.
Yes.
What is the main point? Many people launch the podcast. Okay, I will launch. And there's you have to create your strategy.
Yeah, because people end up doing this thing where they just create a podcast because they feel like they should do that. Like they just think like, oh, people are making podcasts, I should make a podcast. Exactly. But they don't say why they're making it. They don't say what their goals are when they make it. They just say, I want to make a podcast. I think this would be cool. People will like this. And if you're not serving a particular purpose, or if you're not doing something in particular or adding something unique, it's kind of doubtful that you're going to be successful in it.
Exactly. Sam, in your opinion, you produce a podcast as well here at HubSpot. What are the main challenge when you are producing a new episode?
So for me, I handle primarily the marketing side of our podcast. And Matt Brown is the producer of all of our work on podcast. For me, the biggest challenge is data. I come from a traditional marketing background, field marketing. I've kind of in different roles worn all hats, done advertising, done media buys, all that stuff. You just have so much more data that can inform your decisions when you're working in other channels like email, where you have opens, clicks. You could do attribution reporting. You can understand like user trends a little bit better. With podcasting, you really just have downloads. You just have the number of downloads and the location people are downloading from. So for me, one of the early kind of struggles of moving into this role was, what do we do with all of the data? How do we make decisions based on data, or at least that are informed by data? So in order to accomplish that, we had to get a really good sense of what are averages. How do we move those averages? How do we change user behavior? How do we do things that will affect the normal pattern? How do we teach people to do podcasting? Because there's a lot to learn about it. When we're producing an episode, I will say for me, some of the challenges are definitely on the side of like titles. We know that titles have an enormous impact on if somebody is going to download a podcast or not, if somebody's going to listen to a specific episode or not. So that's really, really hard. And then furthermore, like to go kind of to the titles and to the lack of data side of things, it's not always easy to determine where to put your marketing dollars or where to put your marketing effort in order to promote a podcast. Right. How much do you promote it on social? Social hasn't necessarily performed particularly well for us. Do you use Facebook? Do you try and leverage, your guest audience? Do you do billboard ads? Do you advertise on other podcasts? Exactly. It's really hard to look at all of those and say which one works really well when you have a limited budget and you're trying to figure things out. So for me, it's been a real learning experience with each episode to say, okay, well, this episode, we tried audiograms on social. An audiogram, for listeners who are not familiar, it's like it will be a small image, text of what the guest is saying will appear, and there'll be kind of a waveform line that kind of catches people's attention. So we tried audiograms for a while. Maybe we should just try quote cards. Maybe we should try something else. Maybe we should try animations. And so with each episode, we try and learn something new about what is going to work and what is going to help us get our message out there and get the content to go further.
Yeah, and it's all the time. In the podcasting, you have to try quotes. Again, the audiograms are, and then, or try different kind of audiograms as well.
Yeah, you have to try variation after variation. And again, like when things are limited and you want to make sure that when you test something, you're testing it in a way where you know, or at least have a really good idea if it actually worked.
Exactly.
And when you only know downloads, it takes a little while before you can understand what's affecting those downloads.
Interesting. For example, for me, the data is so important to know. For example, in Latin America, what kind of countries are have more listeners, or what kind of countries start to know more, involved with podcasting, etc., or with my show. Is very, very useful information.
Yeah, and for us, like, one of the things I was shocked about is the Grow Show is our signature podcast of HubSpot. It's produced here in the United States, but when we take a step back and look at the downloads by regions, basically it's like 49% of our downloads come from outside of the United States. Yeah, and not only that, like, we also see from this that a lot of our downloads come from the back catalog. They come from older episodes. So we were starting to learn a lot more about our podcast, about like, where are people downloading and what are those listener habits.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's so interesting. Speaking about the HubSpot podcast, you guys have, the main one is the Grow Show.
Yes.
The second one is the Weird Work, and the Tactical podcast is very interesting because they are different.
Yes.
They are totally different. Can you share with us what is the difference?
Yeah, of course. And I think one of the things that's interesting is this is a question. I get a lot of questions from customers considering starting podcast. Yeah. And one of the things that a lot of people are fascinated about is, why do we have 3 shows? Why don't we just have one show that we release all the time, right? Why do we take breaks or have seasons of the Grow Show when we could just release episodes endlessly? Right. So first off, I think the thing people should consider is, like, back to what we talked about earlier, shows should have goals, right? And for us, the Grow Show is a lot about furthering our thought leadership. It's really, in a lot of ways, like very traditional inbound marketing. It's building brand affinity, it's growing brand affinity, it's growing brand trust by having all this amazing content and interviews with people and companies that we really admire. Mm-hmm. So the Grow Show is a way for us to reinforce our thought leadership position, and in a way to espouse our brand values without beating them over people's heads, and to do it in a pretty fun and interesting way.
Yeah, that's super interesting, Sam. In the Grow Show, I saw a change, by the way, because in the beginning, it was like only interviews to authors or influencers or marketing influencers. And now you guys turn more to branding or branding content. For example, I remember in an episode, very cool, that Megan had a conversation with Tina Sharkey of Brandless about organic, non-GMO. Very, very interesting, how you guys change the perspective of the Grow Show. Very, very cool.
Yeah, so I think for that show, it's like, starting with authors is great. Authors are really good people to go after because they're informed. They're, they have a lot of different examples that they can use. They can really dive deep on a particular topic that's super interesting. And I think that's great. And the other thing I will say, just authors are easier to book in some ways, because they're usually looking to promote a book, which is nice. Sure. But on the side of moving towards more narrative, more in-depth stories, at a really base level, stories are just really inspiring. They're just really engaging. They stick in your head in a way that just not necessarily a traditional interview might stick in your head. And they're a way to really like espouse things without beating it over people's heads. Now, when I think about moving towards more narrative episodes, it does require a lot more production work. Right. It does require a lot more thinking and editing, but the result is a really, really strong episode. And that episode, like, one of the major ways that people find podcasts is through word of mouth recommendations. Mm-hmm. It is, if you think about it, the best podcasts I've ever heard are the ones that my friends will tell me about. Right. And if you have a high production, good, engaging story, that's the kind of thing that people are going to share with each other. That's the kind of thing that people will move from just listening to an episode to subscribing to an episode. So that's the kind of stuff for us that I think is so interesting to go through, because it's not only going to do a better job of accomplishing our goal of enforcing brand or of promoting brand values. It's also going to do a really good job of making people connect with the show and want to listen to it more.
Exactly, and have the impact that the company or brand is looking for.
Yeah, it's like those stories just have such huge impact by having it. Like if you listen to one of our more recent, our launch episode with Third Love, it's just an incredibly well-structured story. We have all sorts of different voices from across the industry to really flesh it out and make it seem like a lot better and a lot more engaging.
Yeah, more real.
More real. It's more real. It's more highly produced, but in some ways it's just more real because you get such a more comprehensive view of things.
Exactly. And then there is another one. There's a Weird Work.
Yes, so we have...
oh my God, 1 second. I love this one because the last one is in the noodles. Tell me, what is the name of the guy? Gnocchi?
Yeah. Here. But yes, so let me just briefly explain Weird Work.
Yeah.
So I host a podcast for HubSpot called Weird Work. And basically what we do is we interview people who have just really weird and interesting jobs. So for listeners, just a couple examples are, we interviewed a professional bridesmaid. Mm-hmm. We interviewed professional cuddlers, LSD microdosing coaches. Right. We've talked to Will Shortz, who is the New York Times crossword puzzle editor. We talked to Lenny Pickett, who, if you've ever watched an episode of Saturday Night Live, he's the guy with the saxophone. So he's the band leader of Saturday Night Live. All these people with incredibly interesting, incredibly cool careers. Right. Now, definitely there are a lot of questions. Why is HubSpot starting a show where we're interviewing professional cuddlers, right? So first off, again, back to our main point of there's certain goals. Now, whereas the Growth Show is really there to enforce and really like structure brand values, grow brand affinity, get our thought leadership out there. Weird Work is our shot at a more mass appeal podcast. There's just something inherently awesome about the idea of all of these things, that all these great jobs that get no attention whatsoever. Yeah. And so we wanted to make a show that was massively appealing, but we also wanted it to make sure that it's still aligned with HubSpot's brand. And if you think about it, HubSpot is really aimed at small, medium-sized businesses who are looking to change the world.
It's true.
Right? And so although this isn't, the traditional business that we look at, I feel like, our customers and other people can see themselves in these stories. I think we've also built such a good community and such a good relationship with people around Weird Work. They really seem to enjoy the show. Right. They really seem to like the content a lot. And I think that's a really positive move towards HubSpot. Like, we want to be able to build that connection between us and people without necessarily making it right in your face. This is HubSpot. This is a HubSpot production. We're going to talk about HubSpot things. That's a very narrow group of people you would be talking to. Yeah. If you open it up to a little more inspiring, a little more learning about all these careers in a way that's fun and interesting, it's just going to be a great connection between the podcast, the company, and the listeners.
Yeah, because we are marketers and we know that storytelling is a great tool and have a great impact. And this guy who made noodles here around the corner in Cambridge, he was comedian.
Yeah.
And turned to make noodles because he wanted to change his life.
Yes. I'm so happy about that episode with you. It's a place in Cambridge in Somerville called Yume wo Katare, and they make noodles, and it's about finding your dreams and accomplishing your dreams. Yeah. And the man's personal story is so inspiring because you have this weird, you have a noodle place where people stand up and say, my dream is that my kids are healthy. Right. My dream is that I get a new job. My dream is this. And it's weird. It's bizarre. It seems a little bit strange. But then when you get to know this guy and you get to know what he's gone through, how he's dealt with tragedies in his own life and how he's turned those tragedies into basically an amazing, not just business, but purpose. Like, it's a whole life purpose. Yeah. And it's something that when I go into that shop, I find it inspiring. I find it amazing. I think it has the exact effect it should. And I just wanted to share stories like those. Yeah. Because so often, like, we hear about, unicorns and tech companies and big things and all the millions of dollars and raised thousands of things. Right. And, this guy went to Stanford and then he graduated with this amazing technology. It's like, that's a great story. But there's also these other really, really cool ones on the other side.
Yeah, it's so interesting.
So I think Weird Work is a great way to share those stories. I think Weird Work is our shot at sort of a mass appeal thing that a lot of people will like. And I think it's just a really good thing for HubSpot's brand overall. Yeah. And I guess our last show is Skill Up, which I think is almost in some ways the polar opposite of Weird Work, right? Skill Up is a show that's all about gaining, growing, building new skills. Mm-hmm. So we do it on a seasonal basis. Yep. And our first season was about SEO. So we cover everything from learning to write articles that rank, keyword analysis, long tail keyword analysis, all that stuff to all the way towards the future of search. Now, if you think about people who are interested in weird jobs, that's an enormous amount of people.
Correct.
If you think about people looking to learn SEO and listen to it, like it's not that that's not a really great topic. It is a really great topic. I loved the show, but it's just a smaller group of people. But the thing is, its purpose is much different than Weird Work. The purpose is to teach people SEO, and the Academy and all of the resources they provide. This is just another method in another medium for people to be able to learn skills that are useful for them. And HubSpot has always been about helping people build those skills. And so although the audience is smaller, it doesn't really matter because it helps fulfill the goals of that show.
Interesting. This show have a impact in the visit to the people who is visiting the HubSpot Academy or no?
Yes. So now, no.
Tricky question.
No. This was actually, okay, so this is actually something I'm shocked at in some ways. So on Weird Work and on Skill Up, we'll do promotions during the show for HubSpot Academy, right? Because we wanted to test, we were trying to get a sense of, do people actually follow podcast ads? When you read an ad or when you mention a company or a link to go to, do people go to it? So when we stepped back and did our analysis, not only were we driving people to the show, I thought it would be a lot less. I thought that the barriers to somebody going to a specific link are really high on a podcast. It's not like an email where I get an email, all I have to do is click. I hear an ad on a podcast, it's much different. Now I have to get out my phone, I have to remember that link, I have to go to that specific URL, that routes me over there. So my assumption was that if I was, as a marketer, if I was to compare it on a channel perspective, let's say getting clicks from Facebook versus getting clicks from email versus getting clicks from the podcast, that the podcast would be the lowest performer. That was not the case. Basically, our podcast was able to drive clicks at the same level of our search and social ads. If we look at it from the impressions somebody is getting to actually going to that source. That's good. That's really, really good. And the other thing that I think is important for people to understand is, like, a podcast, Skill Up is 40 plus minutes. Weird Work is around, 25 to 45 minutes. Growth shows right around 30 minutes, and we'll have one ad in there. But if we think about how people are actually engaging with that content, I like to think a lot about the time people spend engaging with your brand. A blog post might take 6 to 7 minutes to read. A social video might be less than 2. But if you think about podcast as the ads as a nice way to drive people to a specific URL. But if you step back and think about it from an engagement perspective, it's huge.
Right.
People are engaging with your content for much longer than a lot of other channels.
85%.
And they're listening really to all the way to the end of the episode. The only thing people tend to skip is really the credits,
I do.
I do too. It's fine. People skip the credits. It's okay. But like, that's okay. And I think seeing that as a channel is really, really good. Not only do we drive things towards Academy, but I think that our level of engagement is really, really high.
That's great.
So I've been pleasantly surprised to see that podcast ads are effective. And I also think when I step back and look at the level of engagement, the engagement is really high for an episode.
Yeah, I think it's 85% are listening the entire episode. No? It's a very, very interesting number.
Yeah, that's almost listening to the entire episode. Usually there's maybe just a few minutes left of somebody just reading off who produced the episode.
Exactly. It's amazing. And also, the smartphones helps a lot.
Yes.
Everybody's doing this through the smartphones.
Yeah, and that's like to another point. I think that one of the things that a lot of marketers, if there's marketers listening, one thing to think about is that you're competing for a limited amount of people's attention, right? People have a limited amount of attention.
Exactly.
And a lot of marketing content is meant to be consumed at work, right? So you have 9 to 5, right? That's basically the time period that people are likely to consume the email, the social, whatever you're trying to get them to consume, which is great. Podcast, though, sort of generally takes place at a different time in the day. It takes place during commuting. It takes place when it's like, I think it's about 25% of people listen to podcast when they're commuting. 50% of people listen to podcast when they're at home. Right. Yeah. So
in the cars as well.
Or like commuting in the cars, commuting on a train, commuting, walking, whatever it is. And then 50% of people basically listen at home. So one of the things for marketers looking at this is you can see podcasts as this great channel because you're competing, you're in a different time. You're kind of reclaiming a time that people aren't usually doing something. They're not consuming your content. And it's a great spot to basically get people to continue to engage with your brand in a different way outside of the normal times they would.
Right. And then we have Alexa now. The people.
Yes. And now people can just, now people can just
home and listen to podcasts without any problem.
Just shout, play the Gross Show podcast, play Weird Work podcast. It's super easy now.
Sam, we are almost done with this episode. What have you learned as a HubSpot marketer?
Yeah, I've learned a ton, and I could easily go on for hours talking about all the things that we've learned here at HubSpot with the limited amount of data that podcasting provides. So I think some of the things that I would say is, one, ads are great. They work well for podcast. Now, the next thing I just sort of want to talk about is some things that I've learned about listener behavior.
Yeah.
And generally how a podcast performs. So the way a podcast performs on a standard way, episode is released, you get a big spike,
peak, and then
peak. The next day, 50% drop off. The next day, 30%. It goes like that. So for us, I've learned that on the first day, we average about 30% of our 60-day downloads. Oh. I think that's a good way for people to look at it. Mm-hmm. So that gives you a way to think about when we know if an episode is going to perform well or not. Yep. We can see that really quickly within the first day. I think that's super useful. The other thing that I think I learned is that one of the things we were very concerned about is whether to do seasons or an ongoing show.
Oh, I see.
Now, this is something a lot of people have asked me questions about, and they'll say, they don't directly say this, but they'll go, yeah, we're thinking of starting a podcast. And I'll say, well, how many episodes do you want to do? Yeah, right, exactly. And they just are like, I'm going to just go on forever. And I'm like, that's like, some people could do that, but do you have like the time? Do you have the dedication to do that? And what are you trying to accomplish with your show? And one of the things that we've learned is we've stepped back and said different shows serve different purposes. That's good. Mm-hmm. Now we've also said, okay, but if we have seasons, that means that we have to take a break.
Exactly.
And then do we lose listeners? The answer is we don't. Because people don't actually tend to delete podcasts, right? From their podcast app. They don't actually tend to delete them. And what happens is when you have a returning season, there's a notification, new episodes. Now, if you ended the previous season well and you've been continuing to produce high quality episodes, people will see, oh, new season of The Gross Show, and they'll start to listen again. Right? So what we've learned is in a lot of ways, it's really good to actually take a break, tweak what you want to tweak, make things better on the show, improve what you can improve. And then when you come back, you'll have the listeners basically that you had before.
Exactly.
So one of the things that I'd say is that
it's a good tip, huh?
It's a good tip. The last sort of big tip I would think, or thing that I've noticed from being working on our marketing, is that people ask about releasing all episodes at once. They go, I want to they go, Sam, this is great. This season idea is great. Let's do more seasons. And we're just going to release all the episodes of a season at once. That works somewhat, but I would not recommend it unless your show fits a very specific format, which would be very short, very easily consumable episodes. We released, just in full candor, we released Skill Up as a bingeable season. Skill Up, very in-depth, 40-plus minute episodes, and we released them all at once. The issue was because we didn't necessarily notify people of new episodes, right? You lose that notification when you release them all at once. People didn't tend to come back to it as quickly.
Oh, I see.
Right? Whereas The Gross Show, when you're releasing episodes week over week, you build this regular cadence.
Right.
So people listen to maybe, in a 10 season, people might listen every single week. They might drop off for a couple weeks and then come back to it. But when you release all the episodes at once, you sort of lose that. So one of the things is that people are a little bit, from our experience, a little bit less likely to return to a show if you release all episodes simultaneously. So you might be better off making a whole season and releasing the episodes twice a week.
Correct.
3 times a week, once a week, whatever. But I wouldn't recommend to people dropping all of the episodes at once.
Yeah, no, it's a good advice. Because, for example, when I take a break from my podcast, what I do is in this month that I take a break of 2 weeks, I start to write articles that relate with some topics on my podcast.
Yeah, because there's other things that it's just hard to do. Like you do want to work on articles. You do want to work on SEO. You do want to reach out to other publications that might be interested. And it's hard to do that in the heat of production and the heat of making episodes, coming up with new ones, finding guests, booking them, new guests. Yeah. And so it's good to take a break. It's good to pause for a second and reflect on that of what's been going well and what else you could do.
Great advice. And now, my friend, the main question. People in Latin America asking when HubSpot will have a podcast in Spanish. You have Laura, Jose, all the people who are listening right now.
I could say I do not know. I'm not 100% sure. I will say one thing that I've been so interested about Latin American podcasts. When you look at other countries, one of the nice things about iTunes is you can just adjust the top charts for each country.
Exactly.
If you look at say Singapore, Southeast Asian countries, if you look at Japan, things like that, a lot of the top podcasts are still in English and they're still American shows.
Exactly.
Right? That is not true necessarily with the Latin American podcast. No. Latin America is one of the fastest growing areas for podcasts of non-English speaking content. So for me, looking at it, I see, okay, if we are going to compete on the top charts in, South Korea or something like that, we could produce an English-speaking podcast there. Yep. We will not necessarily be able to always to forever compete against other podcasts that are in Spanish. So for me, I hope very soon to be creating a Latin American podcast. That would be great to have a Spanish-speaking podcast, and just to be able to make it easier for people to listen to, because I know it can be a challenge listening to a show in a different language that's not your native language. And it just seems like, I don't know, I'm incredibly excited. I don't know how we're going to edit that because I don't speak Spanish.
No, but so, you have a Jose, who else?
Yeah.
Anna, you have
we got a whole
Leticia.
team. Yeah. We have a whole team who could do it. So I think we definitely have the capacity. We don't have the time yet.
Right,
and now though, when we step back and we say so much international growth in podcasting, so many more people coming online it's being very important. So many more people are becoming weekly listeners of this show. When we take take a step back and look at that, it just seems like an opportunity that would be hard to avoid for long.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. Sam, nothing.
I am very happy, Sam, that we have this kind of conversation when we're sharing right now, insights, thoughts about something that is really cool, like podcasting.
Can you share with people, with our audience, with my audience, with your audience, where people can reach the podcast of HubSpot, all of them?
Yeah, so HubSpot is on basically wherever you listen to podcasts. So whether that's Apple, Spotify, Google, Overcast, Pocket Cast, if you have a smart speaker, just say play The Grow Show or play Weird Work or play Skill Up. I encourage everybody to check those out. And if you enjoy the show, if you have any other questions on podcasting, my name is Sam Balter. I'm SB Balter on Twitter. Feel free to just reach out to me whenever.
Perfect. No, thank you so much, Sam, for your time.
Oh, thank you so much for having me on the show.
No, thank you. I am Juan Carlos Giraldo from Boston, Massachusetts. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you.